My name is Adam Hale, and I've always considered myself a simple man with simple desires. Peace, quiet, and a little order in life. That's all I ever wanted. As an engineer, I spend long hours solving problems, and when my shift ends, my sanctuary awaits. A cozy, single-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn, vibrant flower beds, and a sturdy picket fence I painted myself. I chose this house in Aberville, Indiana, specifically because it sat outside the jurisdiction of the town's homeowners association. Growing up, I'd heard horror stories of HOAs, petty fines for the wrong shade of curtains, lawns scrutinized like museum exhibits, and neighbors turned into enforcers of arbitrary rules. It sounded like the antithesis of freedom. My house wasn't huge or flashy, but it was mine, and free from the grasp of anyone's controlling agenda. Or so I thought. The HOA here is infamous, run by a woman named Marilyn Bradley. She's the self-appointed queen of order, wielding her position like a sword. Neighbors whispered stories about her routine inspections and her aggressive enforcement of community standards. I'd see her now and then, standing on her porch, wearing her pastel sweaters and gazing out at the neighborhood like a hawk ready to swoop down. But her antics didn't concern me. I wasn't in her kingdom. That particular evening, after a grueling 12-hour shift, I was looking forward to nothing more than collapsing into my favorite armchair with a cold beer. I turned onto my street, expecting to be greeted by the familiar sight of my meticulously maintained yard. Instead, I froze. A semi-truck. Not a pickup, not a delivery van. An enormous 18-wheeled beast of a vehicle loomed on my property like a steel behemoth. Its massive trailer crushed my flower beds, and the tires had dug deep, jagged trenches into my pristine lawn. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as disbelief turned to anger. I parked my car and stepped out, the cool evening air doing little to calm my rising temper. The truck reeked of oil and gasoline, and I could see a small, dark puddle forming under it, staining the earth like a wound. My once perfect lawn, my pride, was now a wreck. Who would do this? Why? As I scanned the street for answers, my eyes locked onto Marilyn, standing on her porch. She was chatting animatedly with a man in a ball cap and jeans, someone I didn't recognize. Her posture was relaxed, as though the scene unfolding on my lawn was perfectly natural. My pulse quickened as realization struck. This had her fingerprints all over it. I walked toward her, each step fueled by disbelief and fury. She turned her head as I approached, flashing a smile so sugary it felt like an insult. "Marilyn," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "What the hell is going on?" And so it began. The quiet life I'd built for myself was about to be upended, and Marilyn Bradley was at the center of it all. Marilyn turned to face me, her smile widening as if I'd just arrived to join her for afternoon tea. The man standing beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly uncomfortable, glanced between us, clearly eager to disappear. But Marilyn, ever composed, didn't seem fazed by the fury simmering in my tone. "Oh, Adam," she chirped, as though greeting an old friend. "Isn't it marvelous? My nephew David here just got this truck for his business. Isn't it impressive?" I stared at her, dumbfounded. Marvelous? Impressive? My lawn looked like a war zone, and she wanted me to admire the culprit? I clenched my fists to keep from exploding. "Marilyn, that thing is on my lawn, my private property." Her expression didn't falter. If anything, her smile grew tighter, and a slight tilt of her head gave her a condescending air. "Yes, about that," she said breezily, waving a manicured hand toward the semi-truck as if it were a harmless garden gnome. We, the HOA board, had to make a quick decision. David's truck needed a place to park while he's handling some business in town, and your lawn seemed like the most logical option. I blinked, certain I'd misheard her. The HOA board? Marilyn, I'm not even part of the HOA. You have no right to make decisions about my property. She let out a light laugh, the sound grating against my nerves. Technically, that's true, she admitted. But we're all part of the same neighborhood, Adam. It's important to maintain standards, you know? Your lawn was just sitting there, and this is only temporary. A few days, maybe a week at most. Standards? I shot back, my voice rising. You call this maintaining standards? You've destroyed my lawn. Look at it, Marilyn. Look at the damage your nephew's truck has caused. David shifted uncomfortably, his hands jammed into his pockets. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, but Marilyn silenced him with a sharp glance before turning back to me. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, her tone clipped. It's just grass, Adam. Grass grows back. Besides, this is for the good of the community. You should be grateful we thought of you. Grateful? My jaw tightened as I fought the urge to shout. You didn't think of me, Marilyn. You made this decision without asking me. This isn't your property, and it sure as hell isn't the HOA's. Marilyn's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. Now, Adam, she said, her voice turning patronizing, there's no need to get hostile. We're all neighbors here. A little cooperation goes a long way. Cooperation? I snapped, stepping closer. You want cooperation? Then move the damn truck off my lawn or I'll call the police. That seemed to rattle her. She gasped theatrically, placing a hand over her chest. The police? Really, Adam, that's so unnecessary. You're being completely unreasonable. Unreasonable? I took a deep breath, my hands balled into fists at my sides. You're the one who parked an 18-wheeler on my property without my permission, Marilyn. How is that reasonable? Our raised voices had drawn the attention of a few neighbors who were now peeking out from behind their curtains or standing on their porches. One of them, Frank, an older man who lived 2 doors down, took a hesitant step forward. Hey, Marilyn, he called out, scratching the back of his neck. I don't think you can park that thing on Adam's property without his say-so. He's not part of the HOA. Marilyn's head whipped toward him, her smile replaced by a glare. Thank you for your input, Frank, she said icily, but this is an HOA matter. You wouldn't understand. Frank shrugged and stepped back, clearly unwilling to provoke her further. But I wasn't backing down. You have until tomorrow morning, I said firmly, locking eyes with her. If that truck isn't gone, I'll handle it myself. With that, I turned on my heel and walked back to my house, ignoring the weight of her glare on my back. My heart was pounding, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marilyn Bradley had just declared war and I wasn't about to surrender. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of determination. I hadn't slept much, my mind spinning with frustration over Marilyn's arrogance and the destruction of my property. When I pulled back the curtain to check my lawn, the semi-truck was still there, looming like an unwanted monument to her audacity. The deep ruts in the soil and the smashed flower beds were worse in the daylight, and my stomach churned as I thought about the hours of work it would take to repair the damage. I grabbed my phone and headed outside to document everything. I took photos from every angle, ensuring I captured every crushed flower, every oil stain, and every deep groove the tires had carved into the ground. As I crouched near the truck's massive wheels, I caught a whiff of gasoline. Great. There was probably a leak now, too. Satisfied with the evidence I'd collected, I went back inside to retrieve the deed to my property. It didn't take long to find. I kept it filed away precisely for situations like this. The document clearly stated what I already knew. My home was not part of the HOA's jurisdiction. Marilyn had no legal authority here, and it was time she learned that. I placed a call to the county zoning office and was connected to a zoning officer named Lisa. She listened patiently as I explained the situation. Her disbelief mirrored my own. If your property isn't part of the HOA, they have absolutely no legal right to park anything there without your consent, she said firmly. What they're doing is trespassing. Hearing those words filled me with a strange mix of relief and anger. So I'm within my rights to demand they remove it immediately? Absolutely, Lisa confirmed. If they refuse, you can file a formal complaint or pursue legal action. Property rights are serious business. After thanking her, I hung up, feeling more confident than I had the night before. Armed with my deed and the backing of the zoning office, I decided to confront Marilyn one last time before escalating further. As I crossed the street to her house, I saw her outside chatting with her nephew. The sight of them, standing casually on her porch while their mess still sat on my lawn, ignited a fresh wave of anger. I approached, holding up the deed like a shield. Marilyn's smile evaporated the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Adam," she said, her tone sharp and clipped. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by moving that truck," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I've got my property deed here, and it clearly states that my house isn't part of the HOA. That means you have no authority to make decisions about my property." Marilyn glanced at the paper in my hand, but didn't reach for it. Instead, she crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "I don't need to see your papers, Adam. This is about the community, not some technicality on a piece of paper." "It's not a technicality," I shot back, my voice rising. "It's the law. I spoke to the zoning office this morning. They confirmed that what you're doing is trespassing." Her nephew, David, shifted uncomfortably beside her. Aunt Marilyn," he muttered, but she silenced him with a glare. "Adam," she said, her tone condescending, "you're blowing this way out of proportion. The HOA is acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. Your lawn is just sitting there, and this is a temporary solution." "It's not temporary to me," I snapped. "Every hour that truck stays on my lawn is more damage I'll have to repair. I'm giving you one last chance to move it, Marilyn. If it's not gone by tonight, I'll call the police again." Her smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "Go ahead," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Call the police. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to handle your little complaint." I turned and walked back to my house, shaking with frustration. Marilyn's defiance was infuriating, but I wasn't about to let her win. If she wanted to play games, I was ready to take this as far as it needed to go. Back inside, I opened my laptop and began drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board. I knew Marilyn would likely dismiss it or try to block it entirely, but I wanted everything on record. I outlined the situation in detail, attached the photos I'd taken, and cited the information I'd received from the zoning office. By the time I hit send, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Marilyn might think she was untouchable, but I wasn't going down without a fight. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I noticed more neighbors gathering outside, their curiosity piqued by the giant truck and the escalating drama. Some nodded in quiet sympathy, while others whispered among themselves. A few even approached me, sharing their own stories of Marilyn's overreach. One of them, Helen, an older woman who lived a few houses down, told me how Marilyn had once fined her for planting marigolds instead of the HOA-approved petunias. "She acts like she owns the whole neighborhood," Helen said bitterly, "but most of us are too scared to stand up to her." "Well, I'm not," I said, my resolve hardening. This has gone too far. By nightfall, it was clear Marilyn had no intention of moving the truck. My patience had run out. It was time to escalate. The following morning, I woke to an empty lawn. For a moment, relief washed over me. Perhaps Marilyn had finally seen reason and removed the truck. But as I stepped outside, my jaw tightened in disbelief. The truck was gone, yes, but in its place stood something even more infuriating. A garish red and white sign planted squarely on my property. It read in bold letters, "No trespassing HOA property." The audacity of it took my breath away. The sign was bolted into the ground with thick metal stakes, further damaging the already mangled soil. It was as if Marilyn were staking a physical claim to my land, daring me to do something about it. Anger flared in my chest as I grabbed my phone and took more pictures. This wasn't just arrogance, it was harassment. I spent the next hour wrenching the sign out of the ground. The stakes were deep, and the work was grueling, but I was fueled by sheer determination. By the time I tossed the sign onto the sidewalk with a loud clang, my hands were filthy, my muscles aching, but my resolve stronger than ever. Barely 10 minutes passed before Marilyn stormed across the street, her pastel cardigan flapping like a battle flag. "What do you think you're doing, Adam?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I straightened, still gripping the wrench I'd used to remove the stakes. "I could ask you the same thing, Marilyn. This sign was on my property, and I'm not part of your HOA." Her expression hardened. "That sign is there to protect the neighborhood. After all this drama, your lawn has become an eyesore. The HOA has every right to ensure community standards are upheld." I let out a bitter laugh. "An eyesore? My lawn is ruined because of the truck you illegally parked here. And let me remind you, again, I am not part of your HOA. You have no authority over me or my property." Marilyn's voice dropped to a condescending tone, the kind of voice one might use on a misbehaving child. "Adam, you may not be an official member of the HOA, but you're still part of this neighborhood. The HOA exists to maintain order, for everyone's benefit, including yours." I clenched my fists, doing my best to keep my composure. "Marilyn, I've tried reasoning with you. I've involved the police. I've filed complaints. Now I'm dealing with this nonsense." I gestured to the discarded sign. "If you don't stop harassing me, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something crack beneath her facade of smug superiority. "Go ahead, Adam," she hissed. "Take me to court. Let's see how far you get." With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, seething. This wasn't just a battle over property anymore, it was a battle over control, and Marilyn clearly wasn't backing down. Back inside, I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Photos of the truck, the damage, the sign, and my correspondence with the zoning office. I called my lawyer and explained the situation. He assured me I had a strong case, and we began drafting the necessary legal paperwork. Later that afternoon, I submitted a formal complaint to the county, documenting everything in painstaking detail. I wasn't just fighting for my property, I was fighting for the principle that no one, not even Marilyn Bradley, had the right to trample over someone else's rights. As the day turned to evening, neighbors stopped by to voice their support. One of them, Frank, leaned on my fence and said, "You're doing the right thing, Adam. Marilyn's been pulling this crap for years. It's about time someone stood up to her." I nodded, feeling the weight of their words. Marilyn might have been powerful in the HOA, but out here, she was out of her depth. It was time she learned that. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected email. A local reporter, Gloria Watts, had heard about my conflict with Marilyn and the HOA through a neighbor. She wanted to cover the story, framing it as a case of HOA overreach and the fight for property rights. At first, I hesitated. Bringing public attention to this mess felt risky, but then I thought about the damage, the harassment, and Marilyn's smug assurance that I couldn't win. The community needed to know what was happening, and Marilyn needed to face real accountability. I agreed. By mid-afternoon, Gloria and her small crew were setting up cameras on my lawn. The sight of the ruined grass and crushed flower beds provided all the visuals they needed to capture the absurdity of the situation. As the crew prepared, a few neighbors gathered, standing at the edges of their driveways or on their porches, curiosity pulling them closer. "So, Adam," Gloria began, microphone in hand, "tell us how this all started." I told the story from the beginning. The truck appearing out of nowhere, the damage to my property, Marilyn's refusal to listen, and her escalating harassment. I held nothing back, explaining how she'd planted that ridiculous sign on my lawn and dismissed my rights as inconsequential. "She acts like she owns the entire neighborhood," I said, my voice firm. "But my home isn't part of her HOA. She has no legal authority here, and she's crossed every line imaginable." As I spoke, more neighbors stepped closer, nodding along. After my interview, Gloria began talking to others. Helen shared how Marilyn had fined her for planting sunflowers instead of approved roses. Frank recounted how Marilyn tried to dictate where he could park his car. The stories painted a clear picture. Marilyn wasn't just a nuisance. She was a bully. Halfway through the interviews, Marilyn emerged from her house. Her face was flushed, and her usual air of control seemed to waver as she took in the cameras and the crowd. She marched across the street, her heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. "What is this circus?" she demanded, her voice sharp and trembling with indignation. Gloria turned to her, unfazed. "Marilyn Bradley, I presume. Would you like to comment on the allegations of HOA overreach and harassment made against you?" For a moment, Marilyn froze, caught off guard. Then she straightened, her smile forced and brittle. "These allegations are baseless," she snapped. "Everything I've done has been for the good of this community. Some people," she shot me a pointed glare, "just don't appreciate the importance of maintaining standards." Gloria tilted her head, clearly unimpressed. "Even if those standards include parking an 18-wheeler on private property without consent, or planting unauthorized signage?" Marilyn opened her mouth to respond, but the murmurs from the growing crowd drowned her out. Neighbors were whispering to one another, their expressions a mix of outrage and vindication. For the first time, Marilyn looked genuinely rattled. Realizing she was losing control, she stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. The moment felt like a small victory, but I knew the fight wasn't over yet. That evening, the news story aired on local TV. Gloria framed it perfectly, a homeowner standing up against an overreaching HOA president. By the next morning, the neighborhood was abuzz. Residents who had once stayed silent out of fear began speaking out. Marilyn's grip on her so-called authority was slipping, and for the first time, it felt like the tides were turning in my favor. The fallout from the news story was swift and unforgiving. By midday, the HOA board had convened an emergency meeting, and Marilyn's once unshakable control began to crumble. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up now flooded the board with complaints, citing years of her overreach, arbitrary fines, and intimidation tactics. Her attempts to justify her actions were met with resistance, and her carefully cultivated facade of authority unraveled before everyone's eyes. A few days later, the board made it official. Marilyn Bradley was removed as HOA president. The decision sent ripples through the neighborhood, and though she tried to save face, it was clear she'd lost her power. Adding insult to injury, the county zoning office issued a formal warning against the HOA for their role in the harassment, and Marilyn was personally fined for the damage caused to my property. Using her compensation, I restored my lawn to its former glory. New grass sprouted where the truck's tires had carved trenches, and vibrant flowers replaced the ones destroyed. At the edge of my property, I installed a tasteful sign that read, "Private property, independent of HOA jurisdiction." The neighborhood felt different now, lighter, freer. Marilyn had been dethroned, and with her gone, the HOA shifted to a more cooperative and transparent approach under its new leadership. Peace had returned, not just to my home, but to the entire community. For the first time in weeks, I stood on my porch, a cold beer in hand, and felt truly at ease. Victory had never tasted so sweet. The weeks following Marilyn's removal felt like stepping into a new chapter. Not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. People who once avoided eye contact or whispered behind closed doors now greeted one another with genuine smiles. The air seemed lighter. The tension that Marilyn had draped over us like a storm cloud finally dissipated. My lawn, once a battlefield, now stood as a testament to perseverance. The grass had grown back thicker and greener than before, and the flower beds were a riot of colors, a vibrant contrast to the pale, drab memories of that truck. Every time I saw the small, tasteful sign I'd installed, "Private property, independent of HOA jurisdiction," I felt a spark of pride. It wasn't just a declaration, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right matters. Neighbors began stopping by, not just to compliment the lawn, but to share stories of their own struggles. Helen, Frank, and others talked about how Marilyn's departure had brought a renewed sense of community. The HOA's new leadership had already begun dismantling the petty rules and fines, shifting their focus to fostering cooperation instead of control. One evening, I sat on my porch with Frank, both of us holding cold beers. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting warm, golden light across the neighborhood. He clinked his bottle against mine and said, "You know, Adam, you didn't just fix your lawn. You reminded this neighborhood what it means to stand together." I nodded, taking a sip and letting his words sink in. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't bracing for the next fight. The battle was over, and peace had returned. As the sun set, I leaned back in my chair and let the satisfaction of victory wash over me, knowing I'd done what needed to be done, for myself and for everyone who called this place home.